what if every risk on your project was not only identified up front, but quantifiable and visualized in a way that decision makers could understand it at a glance, and you could adjust it, as needed. So this is a future that is now, and in our position on risk is that it shouldn't be hidden in a spreadsheet or buried in a register. But the data, the risk should be where you can simulate, stress test, use it to make confident choices, and before those risks become costly problems. Ultimately, this is about saving money on capital projects and delivery. So, Roger, I want to start with you. Based on your experience, what are some of the biggest misconceptions companies have about implementing QRAs? Let's start there. Just set the stage.
Well, to my mind, there are a couple of things that really stand out. One is that QRA is kind of the gold standard, and not all companies get to do QRAs. You saw from the poll earlier that some start with just basic risk registers in qualitative format, some in quantitative. Some people move on to QRAs. The other side of this problem is that whilst people do these various risk activities, it's frequently a one and done. It's that checkbox you mentioned earlier. We kick off a project, we pull together a risk register, maybe we do a QRA, we get some results, and that's it. They're done. It never really resurfaces within the project lifecycle, or if it does, it's usually to update it to get it through a gating process, rather than being a live document like a schedule or a budget that is updated on a sort of like a monthly basis.
What is the prevalence of that one and done? Is that pretty common across the industry?
I think I can speak for both Albert and myself in this case. We have seen it in numerous projects across multiple industries in many forms.
Yeah.
I think it's worth saying that one and done might also mean, it's something that's on your, say, assurance checklist, and you're doing it because you're coming up to a gate or a funding approval. So there are, generally speaking, some kind of opportunities to repeat the risk analysis, even for the quote unquote checkbox exercise versions of it. But what I find most interesting about this is that a lot of those companies that have those tight controls around gate and funding assurance that require a QRA or something like it, will also have guidelines around how frequently you should refresh the results of your QRA. And those are treated more as, like I said, guidelines, more than actual rules. But the at gate version is a rule. So you will frequently see like, oh, well, we're going to come back to this in 6 months' time. 6 months pass and it doesn't happen. So.
Yeah, interesting. Albert, you've worked with companies who already have some level of QRAs or a QRA process. What do you see in those environments?
Well, the biggest thing I see as sort of a missed opportunity in this space is that the QRA is relegated to the most valuable projects exclusively. And there is, of course, no problem with doing quantitative risk analysis and a fulsome risk practice on your largest, most risky, most valuable, highest investment projects. You should do that, of course. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't also be applied to your smaller projects. The truth is that even if your capital expenditure is going to be significantly higher and weighted very heavily in the direction of those large, expensive projects, your personnel time and a lot of your execution time is going to be potentially quite heavily weighted towards much smaller projects. So you may run 10 times as many of those small projects that have, it can be a death by 1,000 cuts situation. Like you have great risk performance and great risk practice on your big projects, although that may be questionable. We'll probably get into that later. But you may have terrible, on time, on budget performance on the smaller projects, and it may be driven by a lack of robust risk practices, because it's sort of it's up on the ivory tower, it's behind the golden gateway.
Yeah, well, and so those smaller projects they're being sort of relegated to like a different process altogether.
Yeah, yeah. Frequently, it's either an analogous process where they're saying, "Oh, we've got a table, and here's what percentage you should apply, um, theoretically based on historical data." But I don't know how much that actually gets applied. It sort of seems a bit arbitrary in the ways that I've seen it done in the past.
Yep.
So you'll see some of that. Frequently, what you get though is you're asked to present an estimate, for your gate, and it's usually a curtailed gate approval process for smaller, especially very small projects. So you show up with an estimate and you say, okay, you need to put some banding on that estimate to show that there is uncertainty in the estimate. Okay, that seems like a really good idea, because depending on what stage gate you're at, there is going to be uncertainty banding in your estimate, and you should know what that band is, so present it to gatekeepers so they can make a decision, right? Kinda, because the number that gets approved is, generally speaking, the deterministic right down the middle number without any additional reserves considered at all. Or if there are some, it may be like 5 to, those arbitrary percentages I mentioned earlier.
Right. And when you're applying or implementing a full QRA process to all of your projects, like, let's make it real right now. How do you show the ROI when you do implement like a full QRA process? You go from qualitative to quantitative.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
So I did a bit of homework on this.
Okay, excellent.
And it turns out that if you run a fulsome QRA process, standards compliant, Monte Carlo simulation, integrated cost and schedule, etc., your predictability. So we're going to leave whether you've gone over for a later question and conversation, I think. But your predictability of budget goes up by 20 to 40%. Your predictability on schedule, and this is crucial, goes up by 15 to 30%. So that's based on a pile of research from the past 20 years or so. It's an extremely effective way to enhance predictability on both of those factors. Does it
that's really
magically eliminate overages? No, but it will at least give you the ability to predict them.
Yeah, it's funny when in risk management, when you prevent a risk, if that happens, you're not really seen as the hero because it just didn't happen. But I think it's important to emphasize, right? Like some of the numbers that you're presenting, here's how a project can improve. So that I think that's a really important, reference. So thank you for that. We had in the poll earlier, we had some folks that are on the webinar say, they're using these qualitative risk tools, risk registers. How would you recommend companies make the transition to get their ROI from qualitative to quantitative without disrupting ongoing work that they have? That's a question for Roger or Albert.
It feels like a Roger question.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think the most obvious way is bringing someone to help. Trying to do it yourself can work, but if you're not sure what you're doing or the nuance of it, it becomes a garbage in, garbage out equation. We're not sure what this is or how we get there. Bringing someone in also takes the stress off the organisation itself to get the information processed and the right results out. So you avoid, tying up a lot of your own internal resources. You save from going out and buying expensive software, which, again, unless you know exactly what you're looking for, you may end up buying the wrong one, or one that's way overkill for what you actually need as an organisation. There's lots of great software out there, but knowing what each of them does and how they can be applied to your project and your organisation and needs, and then having someone who is specifically trained to use that software is obviously then an additional cost and an additional challenge. So that's where someone like Decanish can come in and help, and I think that moves it swiftly back into Albert's court.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a way that we can come in, and a lot of projects just we come in as staff aug. We'll send somebody to go and set it all up. Your team doesn't need the training. I don't want to answer the question for Albert, but I mean, it's it's about
No, you're raising a good point, because we have
galvanizing,
multiple methods
right?
of delivering this service. There are multiple ways, I guess, of delivering this service. I mean, the one is the one that Roger was alluding to, where it's a package service. We come in and do the QRAs, and we bring our kind of specialized tool set with it. Our Dokenash project risk tools that you'll see in a few minutes here. But the other way is that we do a lot of staff augmentation for our main clients. So we'll provide project managers, project controls managers, risk analysts, subject matter experts to go sit alongside our client staff and work the projects together, like on a full-time, what you might know as a hatted contractor basis. And then what we value very highly, cross-training. Okay, it's a core principle of ours when we bring people on. So all the people that we deploy in project controls positions have training in project scheduling, estimating, cost management, and crucially risk. Okay, which brings all of those other concepts together. So we're a value add on those teams because we're bringing all of those concepts and that unifying principle of risk management to the table as part of our core training.
So when somebody when a company decides that they're gonna make that shift from qualitative to quantitative, what's a typical timeline for companies to see ROI from implementing the QRA visualization solution, the Dokenash project risk that we're gonna demonstrate in just a few minutes?
So I think the immediate is the answer, really, because if you're in an active project scenario, one that you're executing, or in the the detailed planning stages where there's design or something similar going on, and you have a qualitative risk register, it means you know which risks to prioritize, but you don't necessarily know how much you're going to save by mitigating them. So if a safety risk is a really good example of a high priority risk. I mean, safety should be job one on every project, and we all understand that. So safety risks tend to score quite highly in qualitative space. Okay, so and that's appropriate because they ought to be managed. Okay, but there may be a misconception that because something carries like a high number on the qualitative scoring, that it is therefore going to save you lots of time and money to mitigate it. And while again, safety could not be more important on projects, it doesn't mean that you're going to save a bunch of money and time by mitigating your safety risks. Okay, so if you want to balance the approach of risk, where you're covering off the absolute must-haves like safety and quality or whatever is important to your organization, with some opportunities to save on capital spend or to prevent overruns on capital spend, or like I said before, crucially, to prevent overruns on your schedule, then you need to have some idea of how those qualitative scores and features of the risk will translate into quantitative impacts on your project. And furthermore, how effective your mitigations can be at reducing those quantitative impacts. So you can do mitigation planning, you can do risk response planning without doing quantitative scoring on your risks. Absolutely, you can. But you're flying blind a little bit. You don't necessarily know, okay, well, this risk could have cost me a whole year, and because we did some early pre-positioning with this key stakeholder, now it's going to come down to 3 months if it happens. Okay, like you can't know that if you haven't taken the time to sit down and estimate the risk. That's why I say it's an immediate return, because it impacts planning as much as anything else. Like, it's important to execution, of course it is, but it really impacts planning very, very directly.
I think I could safely speak for everyone in the call that some of the things that you mentioned around saving on, capital costs and other, like, we all want that.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Everybody wants that, saving time and money. Everybody wants that. So you're talking about some of the data, you're talking about the visualization. Let's just jump into it and,
sure.
and show people, what's under the hood, so to speak. And specifically, but how does Dokenash Project Risk enable teams to explain, as you point out in detail, some of the complex risk to stakeholders who aren't necessarily technical? So let's dive in.
Okay, so this is the landing page for Dokenash Project Risk. So if you had a project with us, this is where people would turn up. We have a very somewhat garish page telling people how to utilize the tool, and we'll go past that.
It's utilitarian.
It's utilitarian.
It is extremely utilitarian.
It's
And then
very,
I also
very
want
bright.
to point out, Roger, at that the previous screen, I think we have one project, but if and when we have worked with clients, there will be multiple projects that are listed under this on this initial dashboard.
So where we have the our demo set of data for an interestingly imaginary mine somewhere in New South Wales, you could have various different versions of this same mine report. So it could be a 2023 and a 2024 and maybe a 2025 one, or you could have different scenarios being mapped into here, or you could have multiple different projects. So if you had mines in 3 or 4 different locations, all of their QRAs could be sat here. And then this would be secure for that client to come in and look at their information.
Excellent.
So going back past that, so the first page is basically information. It gives a really simple breakdown of what the project was and how the modelling was done. We have a link on here on the bottom right that would take you out to the normal sort of PDF reports and associated files that we use to create the model. We're going to start with the risk cards. So this is the starting point of most QRAs, is gathering up the risks in a risk register. So as several people mentioned, they have qualitative data, and in here we can see the individual risks and we can see their scores associated with the qualitative assessment. So the 1 to 5s for probability, impact on cost and schedule, and the overall scoring for that, as well as things, as Al pointed out earlier, things like health and safety, natural environment, regulatory stakeholders, and so on and so forth. In here we can also see the cause, the risk, event and consequence, or the statement about what that particular risk is, who owns it, and how far in the future this risk is expected to impact the project. So we also have the quantitative data, get my teeth around the right way. And in here we start putting actual values to the individual risks. So instead of just saying it's a 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 for its impact or probability, we actually give values. So here the examples are a 90% probability of the risk occurring, and cost and duration data that shows 0.7 to 180 days and 10, $100 and $2 million as potential cost impacts. So we have these for, as I said, each of the individual risks, and you can flick through and look at the different risks. You can also
and the risks can number, in the 10s and the 100s. I mean, it's really up to your data, right? And I'm a marketing guy, and I get excited about this. It's pretty cool, when we're talking about, drawing insights out of data. So.
Yeah, and the limit to the number of risks that go in is literally down to the individual projects. Some projects, if they're small and they're simple and they're straightforward, maybe they only have a couple of dozen risks. Large projects with lots of moving pieces could have a couple of hundred. And either way, that information can be pulled in and shown in here. So moving back from that, obviously we take all of this, plus the schedule, plus the cost information associated to the project. We put it through a QRA, and that then comes out into the dashboard. And as you can see here, we have the standard cumulative frequency graphs that most people who have done QRAs will be very familiar with, showing finish dates and costs. We have a thing that a lot of people won't be familiar with called a JCL in the top right hand corner. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we look at it in some more detail. Some basic stats for the outputs of the model. And then bottom left and middle, we have the schedule sensitivities for the project. And schedule sensitivity is a really clear way of understanding that if you manage to entirely mitigate or eliminate a risk, what is the overall effect on your scoring? So, as you can see here from this particular risk, so the MM2001 approval delays, if we could eliminate that, we would save 106 days of contingency.
Interesting.
So, moving on from there, we can say, we can look at the cumulative frequency charts specifically. And in here you can change the area you're looking at, you can change the buckets that you're looking at, and you can change the values that you're looking at. So it's really easy if someone says, for a project report, you're actually now interested in, say, the P40 and P90 versus the P50 and P85, and you can just reproduce the graph with the right information on it.
So I'm a consultant, I'm a risk manager or project manager, and the project sponsor comes to us and says, okay, what does it look like if we do X, Y, and Z? You're going in here and automatically changing that data and the inputs to figure out, what happens in that scenario.
Yeah, part of the reason why we went down this route was specifically to be able to handle that sort of thing. So normally when you have a paper report somewhere prior to coming in and doing a QRA, someone said, well, we want to use P50 and we want to use P80 as our value, for instance. All the modeling's done, the report's handed back, and you have a document that says, here's the graph that shows P50 and P80 on it. If policy changes, or if someone wants a high degree of confidence or is willing to accept more risk, and those values change, typically you're then going back to your consultant and saying, hey, can you rerun me the report now based on these values? Because we don't have a nice graph that we put in our paperwork and we show to the board. Here you can just change it. So you edit it, you put in the values you want, and you get to see the results, changed live, so to speak. So that's the cumulative frequencies, and as I say, we have them for duration and cost as well.
So let me throw you a softball here, Roger. What if there you go. I was going to say, what if I've never seen one of these things before?
So we also have built-in little help guides that explain the information that's shown on the page. So, we talk about what the different aspects of the information are and they represent. We talk about the information that's in the statistics table that's shown, what the values mean. A lot of it to a lot of people will be, oh yeah, I know exactly what that is. But, if you're not familiar with it, maybe some of this is new language to you, and this is just there to help. And, the odd terms like skewness and kurtosis, which even those of us that have played in the field for a while, not necessarily commonly known amongst most users of the software. But this gives you all those simple helps and pieces of information. So moving on from cumulative frequency, we also have correlations. So correlations or risk drivers are a thing that people frequently see as an output from running QRA models in pretty much every piece of software that exists. These are the things that say, because this risk is happening, this is the main driver, the main thing that is pushing out the overall end date or cost of your project. It's a correlation. So it's, classic correlation does not equal causation, but it is strongly suggesting that, when you look at the information, for instance, on this project, MM1445, damaging relationships on a particular activity, is your highest correlation. Not a particularly high one, 50%, still pretty significant. But this is suggestive that this is where you typically say we're going to go and focus our attention, because this is when this happens, our overall schedule pushes out. Similarly, you can look at it and say, well, we're going to see that for cost, and here we have third-party location damage. But again, this is correlation, not causation. Now, when we move to sensitivity, which were the ones that we showed on the dashboard, we get a slightly different picture.
Interesting.
Because when we're modeling this, we're running the model once with all the risks turned on. We then turn a risk off, rerun the model, and judge the difference between the two. So now we actually have causation, and we can say, by removing this one risk, this is what you save. So here you can clearly see, we have the approval delays, by far the most significant thing inside of schedule. And interesting enough, that MM1445 damaging relationships, it's second. So instead of focusing on the relationships, focusing on approval delays is a better place to spend time and effort.
That's great. So the data that we've got in this simulation, it's for the mining industry, right? You've got a sensitivity analysis here that's showing, the likely impacts of risk and, what the risks are that are driving this. Like, what are some of the insights that you can glean from this kind of analysis for the mining industry?
As I say, picking out from this the areas of import, more specifically through sensitivity versus correlation is quite significant. But if we move on to cost, you can see there's quite a different picture, and our approval delays has dropped down to third place here, behind a number of other activities which are all referred to as something base. And Albert, I think you have a good comment coming on this one.
Yeah, and I think this also helps to answer Nate's question about what are the insights you can expect to glean from this. If you're focusing your risk management and mitigation on your risk register, especially if it's stuck in qualitative space, you're going to miss some of this, which is the actual impacts of base estimating uncertainty on your project's outcomes. And it's not just on cost, although clearly for this particular model, cost estimating uncertainty is a huge, overwhelming driver of risk on this project. So the likelihood of your underground infrastructure to cause your project to fail on budgetary grounds might not have been known prior to running the sensitivity analysis, even though that's based on inputs that we would have gotten from the project team, sitting down with them, doing the consultation, examining the estimate inputs for quality, determining how they were built up, using that, like comparing that to industry benchmarks and saying, okay, that means that your estimate has a base uncertainty of plus X minus Y %. We can all sit in a meeting and agree that those are the numbers. But until you see it, in black, or I guess in this case in green and white, then it's green and black, then you really don't know exactly how much money you're talking about here. And it's over $10 million at P80, okay? And that's another thing worth knowing is that projects, when we are asked to consult on like building risk practices from scratch, we will generally suggest that projects get managed at the project level at P50. Okay, because if your organization is funding and managing, cost and schedule at P50, then every project in the portfolio has, a coin toss chance of coming in, under or over. Very rare that they'll come in bang on.
Right.
So, but if every other one is coming in under or over as an organization, you're punching about even, right? So if you want to come in on, and by the way, that's something else worth noting here. We can change this to show just the P50. So if we're trying to configure it for a project manager's view, then it may not be the top 50 risks. It may only be the top 10, and we're only interested in seeing them at a P50 kind of basis. So that underground infrastructure risk is still a pretty weighty $10 million risk. So it's time to start looking at the quality of your estimating inputs there. It's time to start developing that design further if your schedule can support it. So these are the kinds of actionable insights you can get from an advanced set of risk outputs. And the reason why we like them to be in this particular format is precisely what Roger was saying before. We would love it if you called us up and said, hey, can you do up a revision to your report? But if it's for something as simple as change the p-value on the sensitivity graphs and I want to see fewer of them, you can just do that yourself using Joe Koenisch Project Risk.
Right. I just want to note, how seamless the change in p-values that, Roger, as we were listening to Albert talk, were adjusting. risks and p-values, and just how flexible it is. So like this is all well and good. We talked about ROI, right, being immediate earlier in the conversation. Like, how does somebody get started? And I preface this by saying and referencing what you said a little bit earlier is like when we come in to build from scratch a risk process, risk management processes. Like, how does one get started making the transition and getting value from something like this?
I think a big part of it is scaling the process. I talked earlier about how QRA is seen as an expensive prospect, and it is. Okay, like if you want to do the absolute maximal version of a quantitative risk assessment study, then it can take many weeks, months even, to get done. Because there's a lot of examination of inputs that needs to happen, a lot of consultation with the project team, probably multiple rounds of simulation and outputs, a fulsome, lengthy risk report that could run to 100 pages plus, including all of the appendices and such. That's a lot to throw at a small project. I mean, you don't want the cure to be worse than the disease, right?
Right.
So if you are trying to if you're coming to this webinar wondering, well, how can I scale this down to smaller projects? I mean, the answer is that this output doesn't need to scale. The main thing that needs to scale is the inputs and the process for developing them. Okay. So you don't want to throw $125, $250, $300,000 risk assessment process at a project that's only worth $1 million. Okay. So what you do instead is you figure out how to build your risk process around developing organically the inputs that would be required to run a quantitative assessment and link cost and schedule so that you can do an integrated assessment at some point. You take some of the things that would be more important and more impactful on larger projects, like the extremely detailed review of the inputs to the risk model. You scale them back to being something that is just expected as part of the background work for your project management team, and you run periodic QRAs based on the real live project artifacts that you would be producing anyway. Okay, so it's about knowing that you're going to have that framework in place, working towards it, and then every so often you put it into the simulation tools, you press the button and see what comes out. So that's the absolute minimal version of running a fully integrated cost and schedule risk assessment. Is it a little bit hobbled compared to the maximal version? Yeah, of course it is. You're going to get lower quality outputs because the inputs are going to be of a commensurately lower quality, but that doesn't make them valueless. Okay. The main thing is making sure that all the stuff that went into it is of a high quality. It's been managed properly by competent individuals who are well trained in the areas of cost estimation, schedule management, and risk. And you're still going to get high quality outputs. It's just a question of how high. So,
Interesting. Great. So I think let's start the Q&A. There's a couple of questions that have popped in already.
Well, I think we've addressed a couple of those. I think it'd be good to show off one of our kind of marquee features first.
Okay,
though,
sure.
because,
Let's dive into that before we get those questions. I'm just watching stuff pop in. Go ahead. Over to you guys.
So we did talk about on the dashboard that there was a thing that most people who work in the QRA space aren't that familiar with, and that's the JCL, or Joint Confidence Level diagram. And I know he's been doing a lot of talking, but I'm going to let Albert talk about this one in a second, because this really is a passion of his.
Yeah.
But this is another way of looking at the data that gives you additional benefits above and beyond looking at cumulative frequency charts, which is the standard way of looking at your cost and schedule impacts at the P50 and P80 levels. Albert?
Yeah, so the nice thing about this, I mean, first off, those still have their place, of course, in a modern risk management practice. You want to see how your probability distribution looks coming out of the model. It gives you lots of insights into how the risk model is behaving. But what those can't do is show you how cost and schedule behave together. Okay, so it's very much it's axiomatic in project management that you can trade cost for schedule. Okay, So like if you slow roll your project a little bit, you can maybe afford to maybe do things in series that would have been done in parallel, and that may save you on, concurrent costs, and you don't have to spend money on crashing the schedule or expediting shipments for things. So a longer schedule could cost you more in overheads and hotel costs and that sort of thing, but it could also cost you less overall. Okay. Something that we all sort of understand as we're managing projects. And the inverse is also true. So if you want to spend more on your project, then you can bring in some of those schedule crashing techniques that will make your overall finish date, less. Okay. So the ability to trade costs for schedule isn't well reflected in the traditional risk management outputs. So the joint confidence level analysis, which is like a NASA thing from the 1990s, so it's got the glimmer of space exploration on it. But what the truth is that it's a fairly simple formula to apply to a combined set of cost and schedule risk outputs that tells you how those two factors of your project behaved together. So we were talking earlier, and Roger's got the dashboard configured to show P's 40 and 90 at the moment. So the green dots, but first off, what are these dots? They are the simulated outcomes from the project. So we talked earlier about Monte Carlo simulation. Okay. What happens in Monte Carlo? Gambling. How do you gamble? You throw dice. Okay. It's a little reductive, but that's why it's called that. So each of these simulated projects is based on random number generation, and using the inputs of the ones I was talking about before, the risk register, the cost estimate, the schedule estimate, and then something that links all of those together. You wind up having simulated outcomes from your project, and in this case, we've done that 100,000 times. Okay, so there are 100,000 dots on this screen right now, each one of which has been color coded to show how they behave in terms of their cost and schedule functioning together in risk space. So you can see there's kind of a quite nice hyperbolic curve that forms on the boundary between these JCL or these these confidence interval analyses. So at that border between green and yellow, that's your P40. Okay. So if you want to set your contingency at P40 for some reason, and you want to balance cost and schedule, like right down the middle, then you would go straight to, in this case, where the trend line happens to intersect the curve right at the base, and you'd say, okay, that's a bang down the middle, P40 right there. And that's coming in January for a cost of, I think that's 1.8 billion. Okay. Now, what if I say, okay, well, I actually want to bring the schedule in sooner. Okay, I would rather spend a little more in exchange for a shorter schedule. So we climb slightly farther up the curve. Now, crucial to note, you don't want to climb all the way up the curve, because the steeper the curve gets, the less advantage you're getting. So you're spending a bunch of extra money, but you're not necessarily getting anything in terms of time savings there. So we stop when the curve stops, right? And that means we can bring the project in by a couple of months at a cost of about $100 million. So if that's worth it to you, that's a decision you get to make based on, these outputs. You say, okay, well, actually, yeah, it is worth it to me to bring it in a few months, because the thing I'll be producing will more than make up for, the extra cost, for example. But what if you're not as concerned about that? What if you just want the schedule to be what it's going to be, but you want to keep those costs nice and low? Well, then you just do the opposite. You climb down the curve to where it flattens out. And now we're spending an extra 6 months, but we're saving, versus the high end, 200 million. Okay. So that's, again, we're not talking about small numbers here. Like, there's a pretty significant difference between the different places on these curves, but crucially, all of them are P40. Okay. So unlike the traditional outputs with the cumulative frequency graph and the probability distribution histogram, which produces a single value at P40 for cost and schedule, this is showing you, well, when you consider those together, you actually have a huge number of options for what might be. And then you can compare those to your traditional single number values and see how are you doing versus your kind of internal benchmark, like your baseline for what that would be. It's like, okay, well, actually, our selected JCL P40 is going to cost us a little bit more money, but a little bit less in time. That's an analysis that you're now able to do. So that's kind of the I was about to say the short answer, but kind of turned into the long answer.
But I think to summarize, this is the strategic decision making The enabling of strategic decision making, faster decision making, more informed and confident decision making that we referred to at the beginning of the intro.
Yeah, that's right. And you can also see here you've got that crosshair target, that light blue with the dark blue dot. That's the deterministic value for both cost and schedule. So you can see that it's off the map in terms of even carrying a p-value, like a meaningful p-value, sort of doesn't. Like it's pretty much at zero. But it's worth noting it's there to be compared to, and if you've already got if you've got a lot of opportunities built into the schedule, or there's significant downside, meaning like the estimates could come in significantly lower, then you get to see how your deterministic estimate compares to your risk-adjusted estimates, and you could maybe potentially still treat that as a target. This would just tell you where on the graph your deterministic estimate would sit in terms of p-value. So it's also possible to do a little goal seeking here. Like if you're trying to hit a particular number for whatever reason for cost and schedule, you can find that number pretty easily on this chart and get a p-value out of it. Okay. So, Roger can just kind of mouse around and find some random, value that might serve as a kind of informal internal target.
Well,
there you go.
Let's do that. Maybe we switch over to the heat map diagram.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
what are we looking at here?
It's a massive concentration of results. So this is showing a clustering of risk output results. So that's the same 100,000 dots from the previous graph, just colored differently to show how they kind of fit together in the model. And it also makes the trend line make a lot more sense. Like you can see the trend line on the previous one was running kind of cattywampus to the shape of what we call the football chart. But when you see it with the heat map turned on, it's right down the middle of the clustering. Okay. So right at the top of that cluster where Roger is, you can see that's actually somewhere in the neighborhood of a P50. So if you wanted to, again, like we were looking at P40 earlier and we were seeing the banding from the JCL, this still shows you that JCL output. But now you can see, okay, so I'm actually inside the green cluster, which is like where most of the risk results, like the simulated projects, converged. And you can read the number off of that and say, okay, so if I want to be like, in good company, where a lot of my simulated projects came together, then I'm going to be hitting a P50 or I'm going to be hitting a P30 or whatever.
Excellent. A couple more questions in the Q&A are popped in. I just want to do a time check. We've got 8 minutes left in the webinar. I'm not going to go over, but let's, I'll let you say your piece before we dive into some of the questions. We may, and just to put it out there, we may not get to all the questions, so you can always respond to the email after the webinar is complete, and drop us a line, and we're happy to kind of walk you through, whatever that question may be.
Sure, we did get one in from Mark, who's asked. JCL plot called the football. How do you respond to pushback from a project owner who sees that the cost estimating team and scheduling team have put together a cost estimate and a schedule with 0% confidence? And they may have a problem with that. Yeah, I bet they would. Roger, I think this is a good time to introduce the concept of a stripped estimate for risk.
Yeah, and this goes back actually to something I think you mentioned earlier when you were talking about estimate classes for costs. That when someone presents a number and it's a class 5, what is frequently overlooked is the fact that there is this huge upside on that could effectively double the cost. Everybody just looks at the first number and ignores the ranges. Now, when we're doing estimating for a QRA, one of the things is we look for things like that, and we look for hidden costs where they say, oh, we padded out this number, or we added some contingency here, so that we can strip those out. So the deterministic number that starts a QRA model should have 0 contingency in it, and that's both cost and schedule. So we have to do the exercise on both. And again, this is one of the reasons why when we talk about coming in and doing a QRA, it's an extensive process, because sometimes that information takes a lot of digging to get to.
It's also worth noting that 0% confidence just means that the project is vanishingly unlikely to come in at or below those numbers. And that is something that, again, axiomatic for project management. Most projects come in over their planned budget, and they come in over or behind their planned schedule. We all know this. So all this is saying is, yeah, you do need that. You do need extra cost contingency. And by the way, that 0% confidence that you saw on our football chart, that was on the basis of a stripped cost estimate. So it did, all the contingencies had been removed, all of the extra padding and fluff from the schedule had been removed, and then we ran the estimate. Now, what you can do is you can put all the fluff back in and set that as a secondary target, and then see how that stacks up in your risk model. So if your estimators have said, well, we're to account for risk, we've added like a 20% contingency, we would take that out to run the risk model. But then we can add it back in as a secondary target to see, okay, with that 20% risk added back in, here's how it shakes up now. And it might be, where Roger's pointing, basically. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question, Mark.
Great. So we got another question here about the process. So before you get to sort of visualizing it, what's the process and timeline for conducting that QRA, sort of getting all the data together?
There's a side of me that wants to say how long is a piece of string, but
yeah, exactly.
that is a little unfair. This largely depends on the size and complexity of the project, the depth we're going to, and frankly, how organized the information is when we ask for it. If we have to come in and do an awful lot of background work, it's going to take longer. If there's good, well-organized documentation, everybody has clear ideas about where things are, when we ask and review a risk register and everybody's like, yep, those are the risks, as opposed to, as we occasionally get someone saying, that isn't a thing anymore, or what about? And, so that process can take a lot of time, or it can be a remarkably short amount of time.
All right. Well, I think we're going to end there with a couple of minutes. So I want to thank you guys for this walkthrough. Any final words from either Albert or Roger on this topic? Excellent.
Well,
go ahead, Albert.
I'm going to kick that one to Albert for sure.
Sorry, Roger. Go ahead.
No, I said I was going to kick that to you.
Okay. Well, one thing I love to point out about this is that it's in the finished state right now, but it's also a work in progress. We are continually adding features to it. We have a development version that should be ready for public consumption sometime in late April, right, Roger?
Yep.
And so we're going to be showing that off at another event that we will be publicizing in the not too distant future. So keep your eyes up for that.
Yep.
And we'll show you even more exciting developments in the world of project risk visualization.
And on that note, I have the pleasure of hosting a podcast with Albert where we do sort of explore other topics related to risk called the Risky Planner that you can find on, all the platforms that any platform that you use for podcasts. So there's a lot of discussion around risk, lots to unpack. Thank you both for this enlightening conversation, your deep dive into some of the data and then the insights that you can extract from that data. For our listeners, if you're looking for more information, you can visit us online at dokanish.com and you can send us a message through the website. You can also email us through in response to the survey that we'll send out for this webinar, asking how we did and what can we do better. But thank you both. Thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and thank you, Nate, for hosting.
Thanks, Nate.
Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.